Typology is one of the first words architecture students learn from a language we call archibabble or archispeak. And just saying it out loud might cause a room full of undergrad students to boo and hiss. And I was one of those students because you can usually just use the word type and it generally means the same thing. But typology is classification with the intention of comparison or analysis. So it's when types are created so that you can start to define or analyze different types of types. You can pick any type of condiment to have on your hot dog, and that's a type when you just pick a type of condiment. But if you're wondering what condiment goes best on what, you're gonna wanna use typology because everyone's gonna get mad if you put ketchup on a taco, right? Virtual architecture typologies are much more about space itself in the game than just the buildings inside the game. And if that is confusing to you, then go back and check out the other video to get a sense of virtual architecture as a whole. My name is Ryan Skavnicki. I'm a professor in and coordinator of the Virtual Architecture program here at Marywood University. Welcome to the Extra Office, a YouTube channel dedicated to my research and thinking. Typology is a useful term that architects use to classify space at its most generic. So in order to understand what works in a variety of different situations. Like a lot of good theories, this idea seems simple to you because you've lived it. Architecture typologies are split between two different types. There's formal typologies and functional typologies. A functional typology is a classification of building based on what the building is used for. Like I said, this is pretty simple. A hospital, a church, a school, an apartment building. You know these well, even if you aren't an architect. These typologies change over time, but the gist of their uses stays the same. A formal typology is a little bit trickier. It's a classification of buildings or parts of buildings based on the shape that they're in, okay? Think about looking at the city from a helicopter, or think about like buildings in a catalog or a set of blocks, right? These are buildings that might be extrusions, an A-frame, a barn, or even like a courtyard is a formal typology, a courtyard building. These are what we might call maybe like a bar building. Not that kind of bar, but just when it's just a flat, just sort of bar on the ground, right? So typology is useful because you can say, hey, is this church building a good church building? Is this church building better than that office tower building? Well, compare typologies. Is the church doing something unique in terms of its organization that typical churches aren't? Is that office tower doing something unique in terms of its organization that typical office tower typology buildings are not? And then you could say, what are the intended consequences, or what are the effects of that shift in typology away from the normal type of that building? I'm not going to go any further than that for the sake of this video in regular architecture, just to say that it is a deeply impactful tool to help start understanding the built environment. Once we have established the typologies on this channel, we are then going to use them to compare one virtual space to another and figure out what makes them so special, what makes them feel unique or fantastic, or what have you, okay? So now that we understand typology in the real world, what does it mean to modify these elements to fit the demands of virtual space? Well, that's what I'm doing here. That's my job. And to start, we just make them up, okay? We don't just make them up, but this is where I'm at now. First up is thresholds. This one should be rather familiar to you. All doors are thresholds, but not every threshold is a door. Thresholds connect one space with another. They are architecturally ancient ideas and tie well to real space. But a threshold isn't just a door, okay? It marks the changing of one space to another, a departure from one world into a new one. Architects have messed with different types of thresholds for a long time, but digital space invites new thinking about what a threshold can be. In virtual environments, thresholds can be portals, transports, or just simply well-marked transition spaces. Thresholds are extremely interesting because they so wonderfully help us tie together real and virtual environments. Next is fields, or open areas, okay? This typology is useful to compare the places in games that are made to feel traversable and wide open. Especially in early open world games, fields use a variety of techniques to make the world feel bigger, often with random spawning creatures. Now though, those areas can be absolutely humongous, but they still have borders of their own, because even in huge maps like Elden Ring or Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, there are multiple varieties of open areas, each with their own unique borders demarcated by things like weather or the types of enemies that inhabit them. Take like Caelid, for example. Fields or open areas are also arenas of first-person shooter games, which have their own unique planning concepts like symmetrical balance and asymmetrical balance, which fall into this typology. Open space is pretty much always active gaming space. Compared to the next type, rest spaces. Rest spaces are areas of a game that you still have control of your character, but you are generally in a safe, inactive, or waiting environment. These spaces have evolved from spatial menus to entire worlds with mini games of their own. Rest spaces are save zones, and they're also cutscene zones. But importantly so, rest spaces also comprise areas of the game which simply provide a vibey break from the action. Next up is paths or loops. This one is also quite legible. A path or loop is a virtual architecture typology consisting of a designed line of intended travel. This can vary from the strict beginning and end distinction of like platformer levels like Super Mario, or to the windy and unclear loops of games like Bloodborne. Some loops are very clear, others are highly disguised, but they are typologically the same virtual architectural element. Next is area of effect. This virtual architecture typology defines any time that the space around a game is impacted somehow by an active force. This could be lava or rain or smoke or any other kind of weather event. The other name I was actually thinking is weather event, but I think that's too specific. Alas, from the beginning of games to contemporary versions, there have been many areas in which space changes around you. And for that reason, I'm labeling this the area of effect typology. Next up is antechambers, which are one of my favorite spaces in games because this typology is only one of the most obvious things in the world once you realize it's there. Without defining it though, you've only ever experienced this and known what it is, but now you're going to realize it forever. So I'm sorry if this ruins anything for you, but either way, antechambers are a real historical architectural element, which is essentially a waiting room, usually in a palace. I have a lot more to say about this one in an upcoming video, but for now, the thing that makes antechambers so important is that they are nearly always empty and a place to rest up before the upcoming boss room. Yes, of course, this virtual architecture typology is quite clear to you, I'm sure. Imagine through real-world spaces of power like a throne room or a pulpit. A boss room is exactly that, the area of a game which plays host to a major encounter or fight. These areas are oftentimes circular in plan or have few places to hide. They are sometimes interactive or become areas of effect midway through the fight. But boss rooms are quintessential virtual architectural spaces which represent the height of immersive play challenges and also concentrations of success, achievement, and player agency through victory. Details. Details in virtual architecture are the storytelling components of space which are glorified or used to tell a lot of information about a world in one small object or moment or part. Sometimes this is through architecture itself, but it can also be in furniture or other objects. Remember, even if it isn't part of a building in a virtual environment, that whole environment is a space, which is the purview of architecture. Great details can make a scene so much more, like the Tarrytown buildings in Zelda or those sneaky locker room pinup posters in Metal Gear Solid. Just as in real life, details matter. Another virtual architecture typology is scale shifts. Now, these are moments in a game when a player or characters change in size, or the world around them changes in size. But it's not just shrinking or growing like Alice in Wonderland. Sometimes you, the player, get to control a tiny car as part of a minigame, or you operate a large machine in some mission. Either way, scale shifts happen to us in real life too, when we see the world from a tall tower, or the world we see and concentrate on shifts. And those shifts can be compared by creating this typology. These last two typologies are when we finally pay attention to the buildings inside the game itself, okay? Usually buildings in a game make very little sense and overall are only organized to support the level design rather than to stand on their own. But most important buildings in a game that do stand on their own have one very crucial role that regular architecture only sometimes has. They must tell us about themselves, meaning by their very shape or label or image, we the player need to have a clear understanding of what they are. Duck buildings are an actual architecture typology, and in virtual architecture, they are buildings whose shape or form itself signals what they are to us in a way that is usually surreal or even funny. In the real world, they are literal duck buildings or basket buildings, but in virtual architecture, they are like stables that look like a horse. In any case, the other way that buildings signal what they do is a different typology I'm calling architecture parlant. Now, the word parlant is a French term for speaking or speaks, and it is also a form of real-life architecture, or was a real-life architecture movement. But I am using architecture parlant to describe the virtual architecture typology that signify, or buildings in the game that signify what they do with words and signs. I'm using this term more as a way to link it with the past, and because parlant was subdued and realistic in form. Anyway, this is when a building in a game isn't just shaped like an image, but text on it will tell you what it does. Okay, so that is everything. There's so much more to go over. Each one of these typologies has examples, historical references, and ideas to go through, and I'm really excited to do so, which we will pick over and analyze right here. So keep it locked, subscribe, share this video with a friend who you think would be interested in this content as well. It helps me out. It helps me out a great deal, and I appreciate it. I'm Scav, and I'll see you next time in the Extra Office.